Hello. My name is Herman Itoivo. I'm a Salesforce CTA and CTA coach, and I run the website ctacoaching.com. Today, we're going to learn about the Salesforce CTA org strategy part and how we go about that in this exam. So, the org strategy, what is org strategy? Org strategy is basically the way that we leverage Salesforce orgs to fulfill our requirements. So that could mean we have one org, Salesforce org, many Salesforce orgs, one experience cloud site, many experience cloud sites, and how that plays together in our overall solution. So the different aspects of org strategy that we need to consider in the CTA is whether or not we're going single org or multi-org. That means whether or not we have a single Salesforce instance where we're running our business, or if we have multiple Salesforce instances where we're running our business. The next aspect we have to consider is whether or not we're doing a Greenfield implementation or Brownfield implementation. So that means if there's an existing Salesforce org already somewhere present, do we use that org? Or whether or not we need to have a new org that we build for everything. And the Greenfield and Brownfield is an independent question of the single versus multi-org. Because even if we do decide to go single org, we might still need to have a new and fresh Salesforce org and not use an existing Salesforce org. Then we also, in terms of the aspects, need to consider how many Experience Cloud sites we're going to have. Is it going to be 1, 2, 3, 4? How many and for what purpose those sites will be used? If we do decide to go multi-org, that means that it's going to be very hard for us, and there are some limitations to reducing the number of Experience Cloud sites if we have, for example, customer communities that we want to build up. It also impacts our mobile strategy in how we're going to go about uh, using our mobile devices in everything. I'm going to delve into each of these topics a bit more later on. So first of all, we're going to discuss the single and multi-org. So the drivers for going either single org or multi-org is for a single org, it really helps to unify the business processes. We have just one org where everything is happening, just one Salesforce instance where we're running all of our business. And that by default is the default suggestion usually in the scenarios. It's better to by default to go single org unless there's something that specifically requires you to go multi-org. The single org also is less costly to develop. It allows us to develop just a single Salesforce instance. We don't have to worry about developing multiple instances. And it also has some implications when it comes to licensing. For example, we don't need the same people to have multiple Salesforce licenses. It's enough for each one of them to have just one license. Multi-org, on the other hand, it's in general, if we have some sort of need to separate our instances, then a multi-org approach is better. So what could be something like this? An example of that is if we have significant deviations in our business processes. So let's say that we have operations in one geography and operations in another geography. Then because of the deviations in those processes, it makes more sense for us to go with multiple Salesforce orgs as opposed to a single Salesforce org for both geographies. On another point to consider is if we have data residency requirements. So if we need to store our data within certain geographical areas, then that means that we have to have our Salesforce instance be hosted in that particular geographic area. So for example, if we're dealing in the healthcare industry, we don't want to save patient data inside or we don't want to save patient data outside of the European Union if we have a legal requirement that we need to save that data and it needs to be physically located within the European Union. Another reason why we would go with multi-org is if we have so large data volumes that we can't be handling those in a single instance. So an example of that is if we have some sort of consumer business that we're running and we have hundreds of millions of customers potentially, and also potentially companies that we're selling to. That gets really big data volumes if we start thinking about orders that they're generating or data like that. And that's very, very tough to handle within a single org. So we have to go multi-org because then we have for each org the same set of limits that normally exists for a single org. Another consideration is the large data volumes. Again, about these. No, sorry. Another consideration is the complex sharing requirements. So, for example, if people in one country don't should not have at all any access to the data from another country, then that's a requirement which might prompt us to go to multi-org if by default we can't fulfill those sharing requirements out of the box. And finally, if there's some sort of need of autonomy between the orgs. So this could be, for example, when we have a situation where we are running a company that's basically managing operations, such that every place, every geography has the same operations, but they're looking to spin off one of their countries into its own separate company and sell it off. If that's their strategy, that they grow business and grow companies in a geography and then they sell it off, well, that means we have to plan for that in our system landscape and in our org strategy. We should not create dependencies for this spinning off these companies in our Salesforce environments, and we should make the process easy to spin off that company so as to not create any sort of dependency that they're tied to our one Salesforce instance to run their operations. But if we do decide to sell them, they have their own Salesforce instance and they can manage their operations there. So when we talk about a single org, some of the benefits and drawbacks of a single org is it's very simple. We have just one org that we need to manage. We have one simple, very simple DevOps process that we need to manage. It really allows us to have a customer 360 view. We can see all the data related to our customers because in multi-org then we can't really necessarily get that as easily because the customer might exist in multiple Salesforce orgs. So it's very hard to combine data from those multiple orgs into a single point. We have a lot reduced complexity in the maintenance compared to a multi-org setup because we have just one org that we need to maintain. And we have less complexity in the governance, similarly, because we just have one system that we need to do the governance on. If we were to go multi-org, we'd have to decide, who gets to decide what we develop in each org, and that can get really complicated quickly. As I already mentioned, the license cost gets reduced in a single org approach, both for Salesforce licenses and for App Exchange. And we have to manage a lot fewer integrations in a single org compared to a multi-org. Now, some of the drawbacks of a single org is that it's less scalable, both in terms of data volume and potentially in terms of uh, business requirements being different in different countries and allowing for this sort of horizontal scaling. And sometimes we can't make customization that are tailored towards a specific geography or a specific business unit as we could if we were to choose a multi-org approach. And finally, there's this lack of autonomy. Similarly, like if we have one single Salesforce instance, that single Salesforce instance is what we're developing. If some specific country, some specific department wants us to do something a certain way, it might be a hard thing to implement that requirement. So we can't have this type of autonomy between the different orgs because we have only one org and everything needs to fit together in the org. So for multi-orgs, some of the benefits really are then sort of vice versa compared to the single org. The scalability of the multi-org, we can handle a very large data volume because every single Salesforce org comes with some data storage already available, and then you get additional per license in the org. That scalability might help us to deal with some large data volumes. We might be able to fulfill our business requirements better and have a better performance in the org if we have multiple Salesforce orgs. The customizability, every single department can potentially customize the system according to their own requirements. Now, there are some things that we still need to consider, like, for example, if we want to have global reporting and things like that, then we need to have a data model that's similar enough between all the systems that we can fulfill this type of requirement in a BI system. And then there's the autonomy that comes with it. We can develop every single org rather independently from one another, potentially. And then the drawbacks are the maintenance cost. We are having multiple Salesforce orgs to maintain. Not only is that a duplicated effort because we need to do changes in multiple orgs in terms of the development, but it's also in terms of the governance because it gets really complicated who gets to decide what goes and in which org. And depending on the model that we choose for that, um, we can for sure say that it is heavier than for just a single org. The license cost. We have multiple Salesforce instances. Our developers need access to all of those instances. We're going to have duplicate licenses because of them. Potentially, some of our business users, our management needs access to those multiple Salesforce orgs, and that requires also duplication of licenses. So we have increased license cost. And finally, just overall, the complexity in a multi-org is much more. And if you do decide to go multi-org in the Salesforce CTA exam, then there are some implications that you have to consider related to that. So I'll, in a further video, go into detail about what exactly we have to consider when we do go multi-org and how that changes our governance model, our DevOps model, and our deployment model, how that impacts our experience cloud sites. What about our data strategy if we have the customer potentially in multiple different Salesforces? How do we get a 360-degree view if that's required? And then finally, also the mobile strategy and the experience cloud strategy. I'll be doing those in a further video since that's a really big topic that requires a video on its own. Thank you so much. My name is Hermanni Toivo. Please subscribe, and I post content every week on LinkedIn for people who are on their journey to CTA so that they can practice for the review board. And I release videos like this around topics for the Salesforce CTA. Please go to ctacoaching.com if you want to find out more about Salesforce CTA coaching. Thank you.